Hi, thanks for joining us today for another P6 training video presented by TEPCO located in Baytown, Texas, and I am one of the TEPCO trainers and P6 implementation specialists. Today we're going to talk about the P6 date fields. I've created an example project in P6 with 3 activities in it and a finished milestone. Before we get started, I just wanted to point out all of the date fields that you can have in the activities view. I've added them all as columns here so you can see anticipated start, anticipated finish, start and finish, actual start and finish, early and late start and finish, planned start and finish, and so on. At TEPCO, we get a lot of calls from our client base asking about certain date fields, especially the planned start and planned finish fields, because a lot of times they get confused with the baseline. So hopefully later in this session, I'll be able to clarify what those are. I'm going to scroll over and show you the rest of the date fields here. We have remaining early start and finish, remaining late start and finish, expected finish. We have constraint dates, so there's primary and secondary constraints. There's also suspend and resume dates, external early start, external late finish, and then at the end here I have all of the baseline dates. You can have 4 baselines assigned to a project. One is the project baseline, and then there are 3 user baselines that you can use. If you weren't aware, there is a hint help button. I'm in version 15.1, and up here is the hint help button, so I'm going to turn that on for a second. And if I hover above any of the date fields, it's going to display the definition of those fields. So that can come in handy if you're a little uncertain about what the date field is supposed to be showing. In addition to the date fields that are in the activities view, there are actually a few more date fields in the projects view. So I'm going to go over there now. And I've brought those into my view. I haven't brought all of them in, but I brought the primary ones that I want to talk about. Project plan start, a must finish by, there's a schedule finish, start and finish date fields, the data date, but there's also these fields called anticipated start and finish and forecast start and finish. I'm going to start off by showing you the anticipated start and finish fields. I'm currently in the P6 projects view and I've selected a project up above, and I've also selected the dates tab down below. In the dates tab on the right hand side, there are fields for anticipated start and anticipated finish. These fields can also be added to the table up above. The anticipated start field and anticipated finish fields don't actually do anything. They're not calculated off of anything. If you enter dates into these fields, they do not calculate anything else. They're basically like a user-defined field. You can add dates here if you want to. At TEPCO, we recommend just leaving them blank so that they don't cause any confusion for upper-level management reporting. However, if you do choose to use the anticipated date fields, I'm going to show you what the result is in the activities view. So here in the projects view, I'm just going to randomly select some anticipated dates. And I'm going to move over to the activities view. Notice how the anticipated start field and the anticipated finish fields have populated. However, they have populated with the dates that I assigned at the project level. So these dates here do not have anything to do with the actual activity scheduled dates. Over here is the start and finish fields, which show my current scheduled dates. They are completely out of sync with what I put in for the anticipated start and anticipated finish. That's another reason why we recommend not using the anticipated fields, because if you were to bring these into the activities view, it could be very misleading if you run a report and upper management sees this report and then they have to question you about the dates. Now let's talk about the forecast start date and forecast finish date fields. These are alternative date fields that you can use for manually leveling resources. However, they are only available in the projects view or at the WBS level. They are not available on activities. Also be aware that using the forecast start date and forecast finish date fields does not cause any calculations of any other date fields in P6. They are primarily used in the tracking view or a resource analysis view to do high-level, long-term forecasting of projects. Another thing to be aware of is that in order to utilize these fields, you have to make a change in your user preferences. So I'm going to go up to Edit and then User Preferences. And under the Resource Analysis tab, you'll see Time Distributed Data. In the Resource Usage Profile and Spreadsheet, displayed time distributed remaining early data using remaining early dates or forecast dates. Typically, we use remaining early dates, but in order to utilize this functionality, you need to switch this over to forecast dates. To show you how this works, I'm going to go to the tracking view. For the example, I've set up 3 projects called Forecast 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to go over to the tracking view, which is this button right here. And I'm also going to highlight all 3 of those projects in the left-hand side. And you'll see them display over here in the middle pane. And I'm going to double click to get my Gantt brought over. I'm going to right click in the tracking view Gantt and go to bars. And I'm going to show you the bars that are currently showing. First one is project current work, and the second one is called a forecast bar. The forecast bar is in orange and the current project work is in blue. What I can do now is I can actually grab the orange forecast bar and I can click and drag it. And when I click and drag it, you can see the results on the resource profile down below and how the work has leveled out. Now I have the limit line showing down below, which is in black. There's also this pink line, which is actually showing the available units. So as I move things around, it is recalculating the available units that could be utilized for that resource. So as I move things around, I'll do it to the second one here. And you can see things level out down below here. I mentioned that this functionality could be used for long-term forecast planning. I've actually only used it with one client, and they were doing a 5-year look-ahead forecast of projects that they were going to be doing, and they used this view to level out the project data. But be aware that this is not a permanent change. If I actually wanted to retain these results, I would have to go back to the projects view and reset my project plan start dates to match what I have currently set for my forecast dates. The other thing to be aware of is that everything that I just did here can be reset back to normal by using this button right here. I can click that and it brings everything back, and the forecast dates match the currently scheduled dates. Now, a lot of times when we're executing projects, schedulers are asked, what is the forecast finish, or what's the forecasted start? We want to make sure that we are not confusing that question with these date fields for forecast start date and forecast finish date, because the functionality in P6 is to do more high-level future planning, and it is not actually displaying the forecasted start or finish of a maintenance outage or a project. So we want to make sure that we're clear on that. It's probably best to not show these fields in any of your views unless you are specifically doing like a 3 to 5 year look ahead and leveling and forecasting of projects that are coming down the pipeline. Let's talk about a few of the other date fields at the project level. We'll start with the project plan start date. This is the date that's defined when you create a new project. So when you add a project and the wizard starts, it's going to ask you when the planned project start date is. This is actually your system date by default unless you change it. Usually I like to set this to be the actual start date of the project. You may want to change this because if your project gets moved, say 3 months out or 6 months out, you probably want to change this date as well to have it in sync with when your activities are going to start. The reason I say that is because there are a lot of views where we look at time distributed data, and you can tell the time distributed report to feed off of the planned start date at the project level. To give a quick example of where you would see this, I'm going to go to Print Preview and I'm going to go to Page Setup, and I'll go over to the Options tab. If I'm running a time distributed report, I have a timescale start and a timescale finish. Notice how this says PS in there. If I hit the ellipses, I have some options here. PS, PF for project finish, the data date. So if I want this report to be able to work on any project that I open and start at the project start date, then I need to set this as PS. But I also need to make sure that my project start is correct, because if it's not correct, you may run into a situation where you run the report, but you have numerous blank pages to the left side of the report on the time distributed part of the report, and that is probably a result of your project plan start date not being correct. I try to keep the project plan start date in sync with when my first set of activities are going to start. At the project level, there is also a must finish by date field. This is actually a constraint that is applied at the project level. At TEPCO, we recommend never filling this field in. We like to manage our finish dates or our constraints for our finish dates with milestones in the activities view. The reason we avoid using it here is because if the project gets moved out for some reason and we don't readjust this finish by field, that means a constraint can be hidden against that project and we won't see it in the activities view, but all of our activities turn critical because they're putting pressure on a must finish by constraint at the project level that is no longer valid. We find that it's much more beneficial just to manage our constraint dates in the activities view, typically on milestones. If we follow the general definition of a project where we have a defined start and a defined finish, it's good to set up a start milestone for your project and a finish milestone for the project and then manage the constraints off of that. All of your activities should eventually, through the activity networks, feed into that final finish milestone so you can call the project complete. The schedule finish field defines the early finish date of the last activity in your schedule. So if you do have a finish milestone in your schedule, this should match that finish milestone. It should also typically match the calculated finish date of the activities, which is this column over here. However, if you are leveling, it's possible that your finish field will level out and actually exceed the schedule finish, because the schedule finish is always the early finish of the last activity, and when you level, the leveled finish can be different from the early finish. The start date field at the project level populates based on the date of the first activity that you have in your project schedule. This can be different from the project plan start because the project plan start is manually set either here in the column or down in the dates tab under project plan start. The start field is the actual scheduled start time for the first activity that you have built in the activities view. This is where you want to keep the start field here in sync with the project plan start. So right now my project plan start is set for June 18th, but my start of the activities is June 23rd. I may want to change my project plan start to move it forward a little bit to say June 22nd or possibly June 23rd to be right in sync with the start of the first activity. The finish field at the project level will reflect the finish of the latest activity. It's typically the early finish date unless you are leveling. If you do level, it's possible that that date will push out. So I'm going to go ahead and level this schedule, which only has 3 activities in it, and you'll see that the date has pushed out based on leveling. The data date reflects the time that you have recorded progress up to and is moved each time you perform a progress update. Any activities that are completed would be to the left of the data date. Any in progress activities would have an actual start to the left of the data date, but the remainder of the in progress activity could be to the right of the data date, and then future remaining work is scheduled to the right of the data date. If you are progressing a single project file in P6, you can hit the schedule button or hit F9 and you can adjust the data date and move it forward in this field here. If you are using multiple projects, you need to adjust the data dates in the projects view as shown here. I may need to update and move forward the data date on multiple projects. Reason being is if I try to schedule and I have multiple projects open, the current data date field becomes grayed out and you are not able to edit it in the schedule dialog box. Let's move on to the date fields that are in the activities view. The 2 most common date fields to use in the activities view are the fields called start and finish. This is because these date fields reflect other date fields. By default, they reflect the early start and early finish dates. However, if I apply an actual as I'll show here, it will reflect the actual start date. So now it has changed from reflecting the early start to the actual start. And same with the finish. It now reflects the actual finish date rather than the early finish date. The start and finish fields will also reflect constraint dates. So in this example, I'm going to put a start on constraint on it, and it will now reflect the start on constraint. That's signified by an asterisk being in the date field. If I change the start on constraint to another date, I have to schedule first to see the results. And you'll see now that the date reflects the June 25th date, which is what I applied the constraint for. If the constraint date is unsatisfied, for example, if the data date has now moved ahead and exceeded the constraint date, the start field will then take over and start reflecting the early start again. So you can see here that I've moved the data date ahead to June 30th, and that's when the activity can now start because it's been rescheduled. But my constraint date down here is still set to June 25th. This, of course, would cause negative float. If you are using the P6 leveling functionality, the start and finish fields will reflect the level dates after you level. In this example, I have 3 activities. They are not linked to each other, but they are linked to the finish milestone, and I'm telling P6 to level within total float. In other words, when we tell it to level within total float, it will only level up to this milestone and will not push the milestone. I have a single scaffold resource assigned. I have them intentionally overloaded here. So these 3 activities cannot be conducted in parallel like this. They have to be somewhat sequential, and instead of linking them together, I'm going to level it. So I come up and hit the level button. I am leveling resources only within the total float, and I'm telling the leveler to preserve the scheduled early and late dates. This means that when I do level, my early and late dates are going to stay as the scheduled dates. The level dates will be reflected in the start and finish date fields. So let's go ahead and level. You can see all 3 activities have now leveled out. My resource over allocation has been cleared up. Again, these activities are not linked to each other. We just let P6 move the activities out based on priorities that I've preset in order to level the resource load out. But you can see here in the start and finish fields that these actually now reflect the level dates. They are no longer the early starts or finishes. I've rescheduled the project to take the leveling off. And by the way, leveling is never a permanent change to the schedule. You can always reschedule the project and set it back to the way it was. So there is never any danger in leveling a project. If you want more information on leveling, we do have a video out for that, so please review our video on leveling in P6. But I do want to point out right now one other thing regarding leveling. I'm going to go to the leveling window, and this time I'm going to tell it to not level within the total float. So I'm going to take this off. And I'm also going to tell it to not preserve the scheduled early and late dates. And I'm going to hit the level button. Now, the start and finish fields still reflect the level dates, but notice how the early start and early finish date fields now actually also reflect the level dates. They no longer reflect the scheduled dates. I'm going to go back to the leveling window, and I'm going to turn it back on to preserve the early and late dates. And I'm going to go ahead and level. And now you will see that the early start and early finish and late start and late finish dates have now reflected the actual scheduled early start and early finish, late start and late finish dates. The start and finish fields still reflect the level dates. Leveling within total float just ensures that P6 will only delay activities if the activities have the float available to be pushed out to the right in order to accommodate resource overloads. Also, while on the subject of leveling, I want to point out the float fields. You've probably commonly used the total float to identify how much float or slack you have before an activity becomes critical or impacts your finish date. But a lot of people question what the remaining float is. The remaining float actually reflects the amount of float available after leveling activities. In this case, I have the 3 activities leveled out, and you'll see that the first activity now shows 20 hours of remaining float. So that's the float available between activity 1 and the finish milestone. But the second activity has leveled out, so some of the remaining float has gone away, and now it only has 10 hours of remaining float. The third activity has pushed out the furthest, and it's actually bumped up against the finish milestone, which shows 0 remaining float. I'm going to talk a little bit about total float in the next section when we talk about the early and late dates. But I'll point out right now that the total float is still reflecting the float available based on the early finish and the late finish and the difference between those two dates. One of the primary fundamentals of critical path methodology, or CPM scheduling, is an understanding of the early dates and the late dates. When we add new activities to P6, by default, they try to get pulled over to the left to the data date. The only thing that would keep them off of the data date is if the calendar associated with the activities was not in line with the data date. So let's say the data date is at 6 a.m., but the calendar start time for the activity is at 8 a.m. This means the activities would actually fall or schedule their early starts at 8 a.m. When newer activities are added, we then apply logic ties between the activities or constraints to tell P6 that the activities need to be worked in a certain order or on a certain date. In this example, I have 3 activities, and I also have the finish milestone. Currently, the activities are not linked, so I'm going to go ahead and link these activities finish to start. And I'm also going to link them to the finish milestone. Now I need to schedule to see the results. And you can see now that the activities have scheduled out based on the logic ties that I've made. When we tell P6 to schedule the activities, it does this in 2 passes. The first one is called a forward pass, where it moves from left to right over the activities and identifies the early start dates and the early finish dates. After that's complete, it does a backward pass, which basically starts at the right side of the last activity and moves to the left to identify the late start and late finish dates. In this example, I have a constraint set to June 25th for my finish milestone. I'm going to change that constraint and move it out a few days, and I'm going to reschedule. And you'll see now that the finish milestone has moved out. In this example, P6 did a forward pass and it calculated the early start and early finish dates. So on activity 1, the early start is going to be June 23rd at 7 a.m. and the finish is going to be June 23rd at 5 p.m. The next activity is on a day shift only calendar, and it will start on the 24th and finish on the 24th, and the third one will start on the 25th and finish on the 25th. When it did the backward pass, it moved from right to left back from the finish milestone to figure out how late can these activities actually start and finish before impacting or meeting the end of the project file. So in this example, the late start has calculated as June 25th, and the late finish is also June 25th at 5 p.m. And the second activity calculated for June 26th, and the latest it can finish is June 26th at 5 p.m. And the third activity has calculated as June 30th, and the latest it can finish is June 30th at 5 p.m. So what it's done is in the background, it has figured out how far to the right can these activities slide before they impact the finish milestone, and it calculated those dates based off of that. Now once the early dates and the late dates are calculated, P6 can use those dates to identify how much float is available. By default, P6 uses the early finish and the late finish and the difference between the two of those to identify the float. So between the early finish of June 23rd at 1700 and the late finish of June 25th at 1700 on the first activity, there is 20 hours of float available. I mentioned by default that P6 uses the difference between the early finish and the late finish to calculate the float. You can change this in your schedule settings, although using the late finish versus the early finish rather than using the start dates is probably more common. But if you go to your schedule window and you click on options, down at the bottom there is a drop down that says compute total float as, and it says finish float equals late finish minus the early finish. If you want to change that, you can change it to the start float, which means it's the late start minus the early start, or you can tell it to calculate or use the smallest of the start float and the finish float. I'm going to give an example that should help clarify the difference between the early finish and the late finish and how it calculates float. Let's say that I have to mow my lawn and it's Saturday morning, and I check the weather and the weatherman says that it's going to start raining at noon. And since the weatherman is always right, I need to make sure I get my lawn mowed by noon. Now it's going to take me 1 hour to mow my lawn, and it's 8 o'clock in the morning right now. If I start mowing the lawn right now at 8 o'clock in the morning, I'll be done by 9. So my early start would be 8 a.m. and my early finish would be 9 a.m. But since it's going to rain at noon, what is my late start and my late finish? Well, what is the latest that I can start mowing the lawn to ensure that I get it done by noon? That would be 11 a.m. So if I start mowing the lawn at 11 a.m., I should be able to get done by noon. So the late finish would end up being noon. Now the difference between the early finish, which is 9 a.m., and the late finish, which is noon, is 3 hours. So I have 3 hours of float. The actual start and actual finish fields are the fields we use to identify when an activity has actually started and when it has actually finished. Now the actual start and finish fields can be automatically populated by marking an activity as started or finished. So in this example, I'm going to mark it as started and then I will mark it as finished. It takes on whatever the scheduled dates currently were, which would be identical to what is in the start date field and the finish date field. Also, I can mark an activity as started or finished by simply selecting inside the actual start or actual finish field. So in this case, on activity 2, I'm going to set an actual start. If it's not finished, I need to either put in a percent complete for the activity or a remaining duration. The remaining duration and the percent complete field for duration percent complete are linked to each other. So by adjusting one of those fields, the other one will automatically adjust. So if you watch the remaining field on the left-hand side, when I put in 50% of the duration is complete, you see the remaining field now drops down to 5. Once the update cycle is complete, I need to schedule and move the data date ahead. So I'm going to go ahead and move my data date ahead 1 day and schedule it. P6 will now use that to identify how much remaining duration is required or is left to do, which is also linked through the other activities. So this is really the fundamental of what we do scheduling for, is to identify, are we ahead of schedule or behind schedule? Are we making enough progress or are we not? It's important to ensure that you do not have actual dates that are greater than the data date once your update cycle is complete. So for example, if I mark this third activity as started and finished, you can see that I have now a progressed, fully completed activity that is to the right side of the data date. Now part of my update procedure would be to move the data date ahead at this point. But once I do that, I always check for any actual dates that are greater than the data date. It means that I need to back those dates up to be to the left of the data date and give a more accurate representation of when the activity was completed. I mentioned earlier that the start date field and the finish date field will reflect any actual starts or actual finishes. So in this example, I do have an actual start and actual finish on the first activity, and you'll see that the start and finish fields also reflect that. On the second activity, I only have an actual start, so it's in progress. You'll see that the second activity for the start column has an A in it, but the finish column does not. And then the third activity is also fully completed or closed out, so it has A's in both the start and finish fields. Keep in mind that if you do use these two fields, which are the most common fields to use, and you decide you want to copy and paste this data to Excel, because there is an A inside the cell, Excel is going to treat that as a text cell rather than a date cell. So you may need to remove the A's once you get those pasted into Excel, or you may want to just capture or paste in the actual start and actual finish, and then possibly the early start and early finish for work that is not in progress. There are 4 date fields that start with the word remaining. So we have remaining early start, remaining early finish, remaining late start, and remaining late finish. I've brought the early start, early finish, late start, and late finish fields back into this view so you can see the difference between the two of them. The remaining early start and remaining early finish, along with the remaining late start and remaining late finish, for an activity that has not been progressed, those dates will be the same as the early start dates, early finish, late start, and late finish. These 4 dates over here will reflect these 4 dates over here. If you are leveling, the remaining date fields will reflect the leveled dates. In this example, which is the same example I had used earlier for leveling, I'm going to level this. I am leveling and I'm preserving the scheduled early and late dates, and I'm leveling only within total float. And you'll see that the activities have leveled out. They are not linked to each other. But look at the difference between the remaining date fields and the other date fields for early start, early finish, late start, and late finish. These 4 date fields still reflect the scheduled forward and backward pass dates, whereas the remaining date fields reflect the leveled dates. I want to quickly point out what happens when activities are done out of sequence. In this example, I have it set up to use retain logic as my schedule setting. This means that even though activity 2 has started prior to activity 1, and it was not scheduled to happen that way, P6 is saying that it will not let us continue on the rest of activity 2 until activity 1 has been completed. Notice how the remaining early start now reflects when the second activity can continue its work. So it is reflecting when the work is expected to start back up. I also want to point out that the early start field is reflecting the remaining early start. Watch out, in previous versions of P6, it did not work this way. The early start field did not reflect the remaining early start. And if you were doing look-ahead reports off of the data date, you actually had to use the remaining early start if you wanted it to show activities where they were going to start again within the next 72 hours or something like that. You had to use the remaining early start field in your filter criteria instead of the early start. But in later versions of P6, this has been changed, so now we can use either one of them. I'm going to go schedule this again, but I'm going to change my schedule settings to show progress override. So here we have an option when we have out of sequence activities if we're going to use retain logic, progress override, or actual dates. I'm not going to get into too much detail on the difference between the 3 of those. The one TEPCO recommends is to use retain logic, but we're going to be putting out another video shortly that explains 3 of these in depth. But I am going to change this to progress override, and I'm going to go ahead and schedule. And what that does is it tells P6 to basically ignore this link right here. A lot of people like to use it that way. They figure, well, if we're running out of sequence like that, we can run them in parallel. The argument against using progress override is that the activities are now in parallel, and if they were using the same resource, now you may have a resource overload. If you're using the leveling functionality, it would override that and actually correct the resource overload in most cases. What is usually misunderstood about using progress override rather than retain logic is that even though I have a link between activity 1 and activity 2, the float on activity 1 is now treated as if it has an open end, as if the link doesn't even exist. So now there will be a lot more float on this activity, the amount of float that it would take to finish activity 1 all the way out to the finish milestone constraint. That's one of the reasons that we recommend not using progress override, is because the float that is reflected on that activity will not be valid. Now back to the remaining early start calculation when using progress override, you can see that the remaining early start now is actually the data date, so this work can begin immediately. It doesn't have to wait for activity 1 to complete. An expected finish date is a date you can apply to tell P6 that you do expect the activity to finish on a certain date. In order to utilize these dates when scheduling, you have to go to your schedule window, into the options, and you have to turn on the checkbox to use expected finish dates. I've inserted an activity here, and I'm going to go ahead and use the expected finish date on it. First, I'm going to mark the activity as started. Notice that the activity is 40 hours in duration. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to set an expected finish date. I'm actually going to set the expected finish date to be identical to what the currently scheduled finish is, to indicate that we're basically on schedule. Now when I click in here, notice that my finish date is for June 26th of 2014. This is actually in the past. My data date is back a couple years. But when I click in the expected finish field, be aware that the date that it brings up is for 2016. So I'm going to need to back this up. And we'll choose June 26th, and I'll go ahead and, to be identical, make it 1700 because I am scheduling in hours. Now I've applied the expected finish date. When I schedule, if I went through a reporting cycle, and let's say in this example that it's daily, I would move my data date up to the 24th, so one day ahead, and I'm going to schedule. Now what has happened here is I did not give it a remaining duration. I did not enter a duration % complete. P6 automatically calculated those for me because I have this expected finish applied. If I did not have that applied, the activity would have moved ahead and I would continue to show 40 hours of remaining duration, but it automatically subtracted 10 hours of the duration, so now I only have 30, which also calculated that my duration % complete is 25. I'm going to continue to move the data date ahead, and I'll move it up one day again to the 25th. And schedule. And you'll see that the data date has moved ahead, but my expected finish date is still holding. So P6 is basically progressing this activity on schedule for me. And if I continue to do this, I'll move it to the 26th now. It will continue to schedule for me and automatically progress the activity. Once I exceed and my data date goes beyond the expected finish date, which I will do in this example, I'm going to go ahead and set my data date for the 30th. Notice how the duration % complete is 100%. I have 0 remaining duration, so it has actually scheduled the activity as if it was on schedule and meeting its schedule that entire time each time I did an update cycle. But you need to be aware that it did not mark the activity as finished. This is a good thing. I don't want P6 just to go and progress an activity and then mark it as completed. We need to take control of that and ensure and get information from the field or from the project team to ensure that that activity is actually completed. Using expected finish dates can be beneficial for project activities where they are possibly long duration activities. I typically support downstream and upstream outages in the oil and gas industry, so turnarounds. Our turnarounds are typically scheduled in hours and much smaller duration activities. I wouldn't use an expected finish for turnaround scheduling, but for longer duration activities on longer duration projects, you may find this beneficial. Just be aware that P6 does update or progress the activity on its own. The benefit is that it will not actually mark the activity as finished automatically. You still have to come in eventually and put the finish checkbox on it and set the actual finish date. Activity constraints give you a way to impose dates on activities for specific reasons. For example, downstream and upstream unit outages or turnarounds are typically done within a certain window or a certain time frame. And typically, the start of the maintenance outage is predefined, as well as when they want the maintenance outage completed by. In which case we put in milestones, a start milestone and a finish milestone, and we'll typically put constraints on those to lock those into place. That helps us identify the window that we need to stay within in order to perform the work. Anytime you impose a constraint on an activity, you have to identify the constraint date, with the exception of one type of constraint, and that's called an as late as possible constraint. So if I hit the drop down below here on this activity for the primary constraint, you can see there's one called as late as possible. And as late as possible constraint basically takes the activity and moves it to the right as far as it can until it bumps into its successor. Basically, it removes the float from the activity. All other constraints require a date associated with them. So if you select any of the other constraints, you need to make sure that you apply the date that you want to constrain the activity to. And there's different types of constraints. I'm not going to go into them in detail, but there's start on or after, finish on or before are very common. There's also two constraints that start with the word mandatory start and mandatory finish. At TEPCO, we recommend not using those ever. because if an activity network is set up as predecessors to that constraint, so let's say that I put a mandatory finish milestone constraint on the entire project, if my activity network or my critical path starts getting delayed and pushes into that milestone, the network will actually go over the top of the milestone and the milestone will not be pushed. It locks it in place. The only way a mandatory start or mandatory finish constraint can get pushed is when the data date finally actually comes up to it and puts pressure on it or pushes it out. It can be a little misleading to use those two types of constraints because the activity network could be showing as very far behind, but if you just ran a report on, say, a milestone with a mandatory finish constraint on it, it could imply or look like everything is on target when it's really not. Now, an activity can have two kinds of constraints. You can have a primary and a secondary. The primary constraint is most commonly used, and I'll give an example of that here. I'm going to apply a start on or after constraint to this activity, and I'm going to go ahead and move it out a couple of days. Now, I'm not going to see the results of that constraint on here until I actually schedule. So I'm going to hit the schedule button, and now you'll see that the activity has moved out. In this example, I brought back the finish milestone, and I've also put a constraint on the finish milestone, a finish on constraint for July 28th. I've scheduled it and I've linked it to this new activity that I have here called Activity with Constraints, and you can see that I have a total float of 150 hours. Based on the constraint date, a primary constraint date of June 25th, this activity has 150 hours of float. You can apply secondary constraints to an activity. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to say that this has to finish on or before, and let's say July 14th. So to summarize, I'm telling it that the activity has to start on or after June 25th, but it also needs to finish on or before July 14th, which is ahead of the finish milestone, which is constrained for July 28th. Now watch what happens to the float when I schedule this. The total float has now reduced to 70 hours. This is because this activity's float is now being calculated based off of this secondary constraint that I have applied. The free float on the activity is still calculating as 150 hours because it has 150 hours of free float until it impacts our finish milestone. It only has 70 hours of float before it impacts our secondary constraint. Secondary constraints are not widely used, but they are available if you do need to put a second constraint on an activity. P6 has the ability to suspend or stop work on an activity and then also identify when the work is going to begin again or resume work on the activity. The fields are called suspend date and resume date. You can use them in the columns or they also exist in the status tab. In order to suspend an activity, the activity has to be in progress. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this activity as started. And I'm going to go ahead and give it a % complete of 25. And I'm going to schedule and move the data date ahead one day. Now that we've entered the progress, it's possible that the work had to stop for some reason. The suspend date has become available. Previously to updating the progress on it, the suspend field was grayed out. So I'm going to tell the activity to suspend or stop work. We'll go ahead and tell it to stop work as of the 24th at 7 a.m., which is basically the data date. Now I can tell it when I want the work to resume or when I expect the work to resume, and I can set this date here. I'll move that out to the 30th. Now to see the results, I have to schedule again. Now you will see a gap in between when the activity last stopped its progress versus when it's expected to resume work again. I also want to point out that the early start and the remaining early start fields now reflect the resume date. If you need to stop work on an activity and then identify when the activity will begin working again, you can use the suspend and resume dates. Another way of looking at it is you are applying a resume constraint or a constraint to start work on an in-progress activity. That's really the basic definition of it. You are applying a constraint on an in-progress activity on the remaining work of that in-progress activity. Now we're going to talk about the date fields called external early start and external late finish. For this example, I've set up 3 separate projects called external 1, external 2, and external 3, and I've added one activity to each of them. And what I'm going to do now is link all of these activities together, finish to start, sequentially. And then I'm going to schedule to see the results. Now technically, each activity has an external link to an outside project plan because these are 3 separate projects. If I look at the external 2 activity in the relationships tab, you can see that it's linked to the external 1 project. Also, as a successor, it's linked to the external 3 project. To get a better understanding of how these fields populate, I'm going to run a little exercise here. I'm going to take the external 2 project and export it. So I'm going to go over to my projects view. I'm only going to open the external 2 project, and I'm going to do a file export, and I'll export it in XCR format, and I'm going to save this out to my desktop and call it external test. Now I'm going to delete the external 2 project. I'm also going to go and open external 1 and external 3 together. Back to the activities view, I have now only shown the external 1 activity and the external 3 activity because the external 2 activity has been deleted. I'm going to go ahead and schedule this. Notice still the external date fields have not populated with anything. Now I'm going to import the external 2 project back into the database. So I'll go to File, Import, and I'm going to choose the external test that I saved on my desktop. And go all the way through the wizard with the defaults and hit Finish. Notice how when I brought the external 2 project in, it re-linked itself to the external 1 project and the external 3 project. So if I schedule again, we'll see the results of that, and we'll see how the activities were sequentially linked and they have scheduled out accordingly. Now for the next exercise, I'm going to go and delete all 3 of the external projects. Now that they're deleted, I'm going to re-import the external 2 project. So only the external 2 project exists now, and it's from an import file. I'm going to go back to the activities view. Notice how the external early start date and the external late finish date is now populated. Also notice when I have the activity selected that the relationships no longer exist. So it's not trying to reference the external 1 project as a predecessor or the external 3 project as a successor. Now, since there are no relationships tied to external activity number 2, if I schedule right now, we would expect the activity to actually move to the left to the data date. So I'm going to go ahead and schedule. Notice how it does not move. This is because when we imported the file, P6 knew that there were supposed to be relationships there, but saw that they no longer existed. So what it did is it populated the external early start date field and the external late finish date field to accommodate for those relationships that are lost. Almost like applying a constraint, a hidden constraint in the background to keep the activity locked into place based on what it used to be linked to. Now this situation can result if you have multiple projects in your system that are cross-linked to each other, but you export one and you export it for the purposes of sending it to one of your clients or to one of your contractors for them to review. But they are not getting the external links to the other projects because you did not export those projects with it. So P6 automatically populates the external early start and the external late finish fields to accommodate for that. The problem is that the person that is receiving the export, if they import it into their database and those links cannot be retied because the other 2 projects do not exist, these fields populate and it forces, in this case, the activity to remain stuck out here to the right and basically constrained for May 30th. So what happens is they go and schedule it in their system and the activity doesn't move. They may not be very familiar with how these external date fields work. So the first thing they do is they go into the status tab. They start looking for constraints on the activity, and they find out that there isn't any constraints. Then they might ask, well, maybe my calendars are messed up and I don't have calendar work time for this, in this case for the time before this, on the left-hand side of the activity. So they check their calendars and they find out that the calendars are okay as well. Then they go and look at the relationships and they see that there's not even any relationships tied to that activity. So they don't understand why this activity is not moving to the left when they hit the schedule button. There is nothing that they can see that would cause the activity to sit out there like that. So schedulers need to understand that if they are using importing or exporting, this can happen if you have cross-project links and you are not exporting the external projects with it. In other words, if I wanted this to be resolved, I should have exported all three projects together. For a scheduler to fix this, if they did want this to get released, they need to come in here to the external date fields and they need to clear them. Now when I schedule, the activity moves to the left and it does a normal forward and backward pass on the activity and it schedules it properly. If you ever run into a situation where your activities are not scheduling the way you would expect them to, and you don't have constraints applied, the relationships are not an issue, the calendar work time is not an issue, check these external date fields because they may be populated. I've run into this numerous times where I would have my Gantt chart showing a path of activities or a sequence of activities where the first 20 activities in the path were positive float and they were green on the Gantt chart, but all of a sudden we get down to activity 21 and the path turns red for no reason. What was discovered is that the remainder of that work was imported from a contractor or from an external source, and it had an external link on it in the previous system, but we didn't have that external link in our system. The import process automatically populated an external early start date on it, and that caused the path towards the tail end of this path that I was working with to turn red and show negative float and go critical because the external early start date was putting pressure on that path as if it was a constraint. Also be aware that P6 will not let you manually enter a date in these fields, and it is a little bit misleading because I can click on the ellipses inside the field. I could go select a date, but it won't populate. You could even try to copy and paste from another field and P6 will not allow it in there. These fields only populate due to importing and exporting of data that has cross-project links where the cross-project links are lost or deleted because the external project is not included in the export or the import. The plan start and plan finish fields are probably the two most misunderstood fields in P6. They're most likely misunderstood because a lot of people associate them with baseline dates. They are not the same as what we call the P6 baseline dates that you see over here on the right-hand side for BL project start or BL project finish or BL1 start and finish. By default, the plan start and plan finish date fields will equal the activity start and finish date fields, but they change when you mark an activity as started. Notice here how the start for activity number 1 is June 23rd, and it's also expected to finish on June 23rd, and the plan start is the same, June 23rd at 7 a.m., and the finish is June 23rd. Watch what happens when I mark the activity as started. The dates will stay the same for the moment, but now I'm going to schedule it, and I'm not going to put any % complete against it. So I've marked it as started, and I'm going to schedule it and move it ahead 1 day, the data date. Now my plan start and plan finish fields have locked down, but my current start, actual start there, and my scheduled finish have changed, and I can actually change the current start to another date. And when I do that, you will not see the plan start or plan finish fields change. So the rule here is, once you mark an activity as started, once I hit the started checkbox, these two date fields lock down. The other thing you need to be clear about is that the activities that we did not mark as started have moved forward because we rescheduled and moved the data date forward. The plan start and plan finish for activity 2 and activity 3 still equals the start and finish, the scheduled start and finish for activity 2 and activity 3. If I mark activity 2 as started, and I could change the date on this if I want to, and I could move the data date ahead, and I could even give it some percentage here. I'll give it 50%, and I'll go ahead and schedule, and I'm going to move the data date ahead 1 day again. The plan start and plan finish have locked down, but they locked down in accordance with how the activity was scheduled before I actually marked it as started. Another way to look at it is that once I mark an activity as started, P6 takes a baseline of that one activity with the dates of where it is currently scheduled at. Think of it that way. Once I mark it as started, P6 is quickly snapping a baseline on that one activity. And by the way, that concept also applies to the durations, like the original duration field, along with the budgeted labor units versus the at completion labor units. Because on an activity that has not been started, when you make a change to the duration on it, like I'll change this one to 20, notice how the at completion changes to 20. And if I make a change to the budgeted labor units, I'll make that 40, notice how the at completion labor units change. And vice versa. If I change the at completion labor units to 30, the budgeted changes. Or if I change the at completion duration back to 10, the original duration changes. But watch what happens to those fields once I mark activity 3 as started. Now I could come in and change the original duration. I'll change this to 15. It does nothing to my at complete. And if I change my at complete, it does nothing to the original. So these two fields, the original and the at completion, have been disconnected from each other once I mark the activity as started. Same with the labor units. The budgeted labor units field and the at completion labor units fields have been disconnected from each other. But when the activity is not started, I'll go ahead and deprogress this activity. Notice how they resync back to what the budgeted is. So now the at completion for both the duration and for the labor units has reverted back to what the current budgeted is. Keep in mind that the plan start and plan finish fields are not the baseline start and baseline finish fields. They can be related in a sense, and I'm going to explain that when I start talking about the baseline project start and the baseline project finish in the next section of this video. The plan start and plan finish fields really probably should not be used for anything if you are maintaining a baseline against the project. The plan start and plan finish don't add any value for any type of reporting. If anything, they cause more confusion. Sometimes I get questioned, why does P6 even have those fields in there? The only explanation I have is this. I'm going to go up to Project, and I'm going to go to Assign Baselines. Now, I have not created a baseline for this project yet. Notice how the project baseline says Current Project, and the user primary baseline says Current Project. P6 always has to be looking at some sort of baseline data. So by default, it looks at itself until we create a new baseline and assign that new baseline. It's using itself as the current project baseline. And in order to use itself as the current project baseline, it references the planned fields, the plan start and plan finish, along with the original duration and along with the budgeted units fields. I consider it a type of poor man's baseline. P6 is still calculating earned value and baseline data even though you do not have a baseline created. Now let's talk about baseline dates, baseline project start and baseline project finish. The actual baseline date fields start with BL. You want to make sure that you understand that and that you're not getting those confused with the plan start and plan finish that I talked about previously. You can have 4 baselines in P6. I'm going to go up to Project, Assign Baselines. And if I had created 4 different baselines, I would see them here in the drop-down list, and I can assign a project baseline, which everybody sees. So any other P6 users that log into this project, if you have assigned a project baseline to it, that is the baseline they will see. There's also 3 user baselines. There is a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary. In TEPCO, we recommend having 2 baselines at least on the project turnaround executions that we do. The first baseline can include any added work because during the execution of a maintenance outage or a turnaround, we find discovery work and we need to add that to the baseline. There are schedulers that disagree with that concept, but you have to have the activities or the new hours added to the baseline if you want to calculate earned value for them. We also recommend having another baseline, which is the original untouched baseline, and we typically assign that as the user primary baseline. I rarely use a secondary or tertiary. Now, I'm mainly going to stay focused on the BL project start and the BL project finish because the BL1, which is the user baseline one, and BL1 finish, which is also from the user baseline, these are all the user baselines. And I did bring the fields in here, but I'm really not going to do anything with those because if you understand the concepts of the BL project baseline, the other 3 user baselines apply in the same manner. When we create baselines, there is an admin preference that needs to be understood. And basically, this admin preference defines which date fields inside a baseline the current project is supposed to reference. To better explain, I'm going to mark this activity as started. Now remember, when I mark it as started, the plan start and plan finish fields lock down and they become disconnected from my currently scheduled start and finish. I'm also going to schedule now and move the data date ahead 1 day so you can see the results on the Gantt chart. Notice how, if this is a baseline bar, that this baseline bar is back here, but the rest of the work that's scheduled out, the baseline bars stayed in sync and the baseline bars moved with those activities. That is because of what I was talking about earlier regarding the plan start and plan finish fields. We don't have a baseline created right now. P6 is looking at itself as the baseline. So if I go up to assign baselines, you can see the project baseline is the current project. Because of this, P6 is referencing the plan start and plan finish date fields as the baseline, and that's why these bars are also right now reflecting the plan start and plan finish fields. If I create an actual baseline right now, off of my current dates, the way the schedule is right now, we would expect the baseline to reflect the yellow bars to be in sync with no variance against the current bars. In other words, if I were to create a baseline right now, a brand new baseline, we would expect this yellow bar in the baseline to actually run the full duration of this activity. This is where we need to understand the admin preferences. So I'm going to go to the admin menu and then to admin preferences. Under the earned value tab in the admin preferences window, at the bottom, there is a spot called Earned Value Calculations, and it says, when calculating earned value from a baseline, use budgeted values with planned dates. The other options are at completion values with current dates or budgeted values with current dates. So these 2 right here will reflect or look at the current dates in the baseline. But the one that comes with P6 out of the box as the default is budgeted values with planned dates. I'm going to leave that there for now. And I'm going to go up to Project, Maintain Baselines, and I'm going to add a baseline. I'm going to save a copy of the current project as the baseline. And that's done. Now I'm going to go assign the baseline as the project baseline. So I come in here and I go to the project baseline dropdown. I make sure I select this baseline right here, which is the one I just created. Watch the Gantt chart. Notice how the yellow bars have not changed. They are still reflecting the plan dates from over here, but they're not actually reflecting these plan dates of the current schedule. They're reflecting the plan start and plan finish date fields inside the baseline schedule, which is stored in the background. This can be confusing because when people want to create a baseline, they expect there to not be any variance. And I brought in the variance for the project baseline finish date field here, and you can see that I'm 10 hours behind on that one. So this is a little bit misleading because when we create a new baseline, we expect there to not be any variance and that we want a baseline with whatever the current scheduled dates are. I'm going to go back up to the admin menu, to admin preferences, and I'm going to change this. And let's use at completion values with current dates. Watch the Gantt chart again when I close this. Notice how it did not change. This is because you have to have the admin preference for this set in place before you actually create the baseline. You cannot create a baseline and then toggle or change that afterwards. So what I'm going to do now, I've already gone to admin preferences and I've made sure that this is now showing at completion values with current dates. I'm going to create a new baseline. So I'm going to go up to Project, Maintain Baselines, and I'm going to go ahead and label this as old, just so we don't get confused. And I'm going to add a new baseline. I'm still going to save a copy of the current project as the baseline, and that's going to be now B2. And I'm going to close this. Now I need to go assign that new baseline, so I'm going to go up to Project, Assign Baselines, and I'm going to change this one to the new one that I created, which is the one with B2 on it. Watch what happens to the Gantt chart. Now I have created a baseline with 0 variance, and it is baseline based on the current start and finish dates rather than the planned start and finish that were on the activity. So to summarize planned dates and baseline dates, the planned start and planned finish fields lock down or disconnect from the current start and the current finish fields once we mark an activity as started. The second I mark an activity as started, these two fields disconnect. If you have marked activities as started or finished, and then you're going to create a baseline after you've already entered some progress, or if you need to rebaseline, you need to have a clear understanding of the admin preferences. So if I go back to admin preferences, I need to make sure that I understand under the Earn Value tab this setting right here, because if it's set to the bottom one, which is budgeted values with planned dates, the baseline data is going to look at the planned date fields in the baseline, which were derived from the current project planned date fields, which may not be in sync with the current schedule because we have entered progress and we have marked the started checkbox on some activities. So if you want a 0 variance baseline anytime you create a new baseline, you need to choose at completion values with current dates. You can also use budgeted values with current dates, but the budgeted values, that is related to hours. So if you've increased or decreased hours, you might be best just using at completion values with current dates. The main thing to understand here is that this setting has to be in place before you create a baseline. You cannot create a baseline and then change this setting. So you want to make sure that when you implement P6 at your company, that these types of settings are well understood and that you have them correct from the start so that everybody is scheduling and creating baselines with the same parameters and we're all working on the same page. And one of the main things I try to teach about plan start and plan finish when I'm doing P6 training courses is that once you have a baseline created and you are referencing the baseline to track your variance against, the plan start and plan finish fields are no longer of use. You may as well not show them in any of your layouts. You want to stick to showing the baseline project start and the baseline project finish. This goes with the hours fields as well and duration fields. You want to start showing BL durations or BL labor units. Do not show budgeted labor units or budgeted duration or original duration. You want to make sure that once you have created a baseline, that all of the fields that you're showing that you want to track variance against have the BL in front of them, indicating that it's the baseline that you're actually tracking variance against or comparing against. So the plan start and plan finish fields are really of no use once you have a baseline created, and you should not look at them, probably should not use them for anything, and definitely don't put them into any reports, because if these are out of sync with what your baseline dates are and a manager sees that, they can get confused and start questioning the functionality of P6 or what you may be doing in P6. The last thing I'm going to show you in this video are resource assignment dates and how they relate to the activity dates. Be aware that resource assignments in P6 do not contain any baseline data. So there are no baseline dates, there is no earned value data. This would be very beneficial if Oracle would add this because there is a lot of reporting that we do, especially in downstream and upstream turnarounds and projects in the oil and gas industry, where we need to run earned value reports against specific resource assignments or resources and the companies that they belong to. So I'm using the same example that I've been using, and I've selected activity number 3. Right now I have 2 resources assigned to this. To clarify about the baseline data, I'm going to right click down in the Assignments tab and go to Customize Resource Columns. And if you look in here, I'll expand the Dates tab. You'll see nothing that says BL on the front of it, and none of the date fields that I've brought over have BL in front of it either. So there is not any baseline data being referenced here. This applies as well to the Resource Assignments view over here on the left-hand side. With that said, be aware that when you see planned start or planned finish down on a resource assignment, this is not the baseline data. It is the same planned start and planned finish date information that you get when you're up on the activity that we discussed previously. So it's best to not display the planned start and planned finish fields for resource assignments if you are using a baseline, which you should be using a baseline during the execution of your project. Another thing I want to point out are these fields called drive activity dates. It's a checkbox option, and what this does is it tells P6 that whatever dates we have down on the assignments should also drive the dates on the overall activity. Now if I take these off, I can come down here and change my date on the assignment. That moved out to the 30th because of the calendar. But notice how on the activity itself, it has not changed the date to the 30th. So now my resource assignment dates are not in sync with the activity dates. One problem is that if I turn the drive activity dates field back on, the actual P6 dates on the activity do not reflect the assignment dates yet. So I'm still out of sync. This is a problem. So it's best if you see this drive activity dates field here, this checkbox, it's best if you do not ever turn that off because your dates can get out of sync down on the activity resource assignment with the actual activity dates. And there is no way to actually sync them back up except to manually sync them back up. With the drive activity dates option back on, I have resynced up my start and finish dates on the assignments. I want to show you a couple of other things that you can do here. First of all, I can put lag on an assignment, which will offset the start date of that assignment from the start date of the actual activity. So here I'm going to put 10 hours of lag on here. I hit enter. Notice how the activity has now moved out to June 30th, which is a Monday, so it did skip over the weekend. Also notice how when I did this, the activity finish date also changed. The start and finish on activity number 3 here are reflecting the earliest start of the resource assignment. The scaffold resource is starting on June 26th at 700. The instrumentation resource is finishing, it's the latest finished on June 30th at 1700. The activity start and finish dates up above reflect that. I'll go ahead and remove the lag again. You can also manually do this, so I didn't have to do that with lag. I could actually take this activity assignment here and I could move it out to the 30th manually. So I'm going to change this date manually. It moves it out to the 30th. The dates on the activity reflect this change. Also notice how P6 automatically imposed the lag for me. So I can either enter lag to offset the start time of this resource assignment, or I could manually offset the start time. I could move it out a week, and you'll notice that the lag increases. I'm going to go ahead and take the lag back off, and that will sync up the start and finish dates between these 2 resource assignments. Also be aware that I can have an offset of durations here. So the scaffold could be 10 hours in duration, but the instrumentation could be 20 hours in duration. When I do that, the finish for the instrumentation resource pushes out to June 30th, And you'll also see that that's been reflected on the activity. So the activity start and finish dates are going to reflect whatever the combination of the dates are down on the resource assignments. And finally, I'm going to go and apply an actual start and actual finish to one of the resource assignments. And the calendar has been moved ahead to 2016, so I need to back that up a bit. I'm just going to say that it did start when the activity was currently scheduled to start, so June 26th at 7 a.m. Notice how when the actual start has been applied, the actual start has also been applied up at the activity level. This is because the actual starts down on the resource assignments also drives the actual start at the overall activity. Now watch what happens when I put an actual finish on. And we'll just say June 26th, but I'll make it for noon. Notice how I do have an actual finish here, but activity 3 at the activity level did not apply an actual finish. That's because my second resource assignment has not been finished yet. So I'm going to have to actually mark the second resource assignment as started and finished. And once I do that, we'll say this happened June 26th, but I'll put it for 1700. Now you can see that the actual start of the activity reflects the actual starts of the resource assignments. The actual finish reflects the latest actual finish resource assignment. We'd like to thank you for watching this TEPCO YouTube video on P6 dates. If you'd like more information on TEPCO's services or our training schedule, please visit www.tepco.us.